All right, we are live tonight with School Psych Podcast. We're going to get right into things because this is part 2 of our discussion on executive functioning with our very important guest, and he's got a lot of information to cover and a lot of useful things to talk about, so we're going to kind of get rolling with it. But my name is Rachel, and I'm a school psychologist currently working in the state of Maryland. Rebecca?
Hi, I'm Rebecca, and I'm a school psychologist working in the state of Connecticut. I'd like to tell you guys a little bit about how to ask questions or make comments. So please go to the to either Facebook page, School Psyched, Your School Psychologist, or the School Psyched Podcast page, and you can just comment under the top post, which is the post for tonight's podcast, or sometimes people send messages with the message feature, that's fine too, and comment on Twitter using hashtag psychedpodcast. I'll be looking for your messages, questions, and comments, and please feel free to ask specific questions about the kiddos you're working with. Anna?
Hi, I'm Anna. I'm a school psych working in New York State, and I want to introduce, you wanted to see my cats, right? This is Ariel.
Okay.
Ow. Okay, that was a bad idea. I want to introduce our guest, Dr. Matt Rebeck. He's a school neuropsychologist. He works for Posey County Special Services. He's also an adjunct professor at USI, so he teaches neuropsych, and he's very, very smart and has lots of info for us. So thanks again for joining us tonight, Matt.
Oh, thank you for the very nice introduction. Great to be back here. Can you guys see my screen okay here?
We just see black at this point, because I know that you're having trouble with your webcam, but your screen share should hopefully still work.
Okay, because I have my PowerPoint slides up.
Did you do the screen share over on the left side? The little, it's green.
Oh, there we go. And then I hit entire screen? Or,
yeah.
Oh, hold on. How about this?
However you have it set up.
Okay, I got you. How about now?
Yeah.
All right, okay. So, obviously I had way too much information last time, so I'm just going to kind of cut to the part that it seems like a lot of people are wanting to learn about, is just kind of the actual executive functions themselves. I'll talk a little bit about some of the tests that we use to assess executive functions, directly assess. I didn't put anything in about rating scales in here. And I have a couple case studies that I'll talk about, and how executive functions can look completely different for different kiddos, and open it up to some questions, hopefully, and kind of go from there. Okay, so I took these definitions from Dr. Miller's book of the second edition of School Neuropsychological Assessment, which is available, I think, for about $30 or something, so pretty cheap, within all of our price ranges, hopefully. So anyway, cognitive flexibility, Dr. Miller defines it as difficulty with transitions from one activity to another, tendency to perseverate or to get stuck. Another way to think about perseveration is to persist, and difficulties letting go. So, of course, when we talk about cognitive flexibility right away, at least I do, I think about our kiddos on the spectrum, that they have a lot of cognitive flexibility difficulty. They're very rigid in their thought process. So a lot of times kiddos on the spectrum have difficulties with flexibility. There's a lot of times, too, kids who just have behavior problems in general have difficulties with flexibility. Sometimes even our kids who are anxious have some cognitive flexibility issues. Concept formation. Now, this is important with learning and relating new information to previous information, okay? And this facilitates storage and retrieval of information, and there's two components that we can look at with concept generation or formation. There's the concept generation, which is the actual problem-solving action or behavior, while concept recognition is the cognitive component. Okay, and the DCAFs does actually a very good job separating the two, where you give the kid these cards, and they sort these cards in different categories. Whether you put these cards that are blue over here and these cards that are yellow over here. So the kid has to do the sort, which is the action part of the behavior, and then they have to describe to you how they made the sort. So you get the action, and you get their thought process behind it. And then the next condition is that you make the sort for the kid, and then they describe it to you. So if they do poor on the first condition, it could just mean that they have some poor problem-solving behavior. I'm sorry, if they do poor on the first condition, but then do really good on the second condition, you know, where you make the sorts for them, then they could have some poor problem-solving behavior, but they have the cognitive component. So you're looking at not a lack of knowledge on how to form those concepts, but you're looking at more of a performance, being able to do it. Sometimes even some initiation difficulties. And you know, using the rest of your data that you collected through your evaluation can then help you determine, is it an initiation problem, is it a performance problem, you know, those kinds of things. All right, now fluid reasoning. This assists with complex choices and decisions, understanding the interconnections between subject matter, and learning to identify and ask relevant questions. Okay, now concept formation or generation and fluid reasoning are pretty similar. But the main difference with fluid reasoning is that they're looking at these abstract designs, or more of this information they've never seen before, novel information. Where concept formation, on the other hand, when you assess it, it's information these kids already know, but they find similarities between them. You can even think of our card sorting tasks as the similarities task, you know, on our Wechsler series, but on steroids.
Mm-hmm.
And the fluid reasoning tasks are things like the matrix reasoning. Now, I'm going to talk, you know, when I talk about these assessments and how they're related, I use, you know, the assessments that I'm used to. So I use the Wechsler series. So, you know, of course, with the KABC and the Woodcock-Johnson, you know, those kinds of tests, they all have, Stanford-Binet, you know, they all have their equivalents to the fluid reasoning assessments, but you know, I'm just not as familiar with those. Okay. Let's see. Okay, so, and I forgot, I'm sorry, I apologize, to put inhibition on there, but that's just the child's ability to relearn a way to respond to stimuli, to usual stimuli that they're used to, and kind of to control an impulse. You know, for example, you can think of a very common test for inhibition is called the Stroop test, where there's these colored words like red, yellow, blue, but they're printed in a different colored ink. So like the word red is printed in blue ink. So the child has to read the ink color and not read the word. So they have to inhibit that more salient or that more automized or automatic response to read the word. Okay, so that's how we can measure inhibition, one of the mini tests. Okay, so as far as interventions, you know, it's very tricky just to, and sometimes even problematic, to just look at executive functioning alone in isolation and try to come up with come up with interventions, because you should always, your interventions and ideas should be based on how the kid performed as a whole. You know, through your whole assessment, not just on these executive functions. Also, when you're coming up with these executive functions, it's important to understand about, can the parents and can the school provide this intervention in the classroom? Is it practical? Okay, because there's a lot of times, as with ADHD, there's a lot of times that you see the same executive dysfunction with the parents as you see with the children. So, you know, that is also an area that can be a little problematic when you're thinking about interventions to try at home, because, you know, with these ADHD parents, you know, that they're late to the meetings all the time, or they lose the rating scales, you know, those kinds of things, and they lack that consistency. And unfortunately, these kids with these executive functioning deficits need that consistency. So sometimes you have to train the parents, you know, on these kinds of things as well. So the first level is that you can intervene at the environment. Okay, so again, these are just very generalized type of interventions. Okay, and in my reports at the end, I try to put in some interventions. Okay, and when I talk about these kinds of things, I use it as, this should be considered a start point. This is by no means the only thing that we can do, but this should be a start point, and we ourselves need to implement our cognitive flexibility in these situations and adapt if something doesn't work or if we need to tweak it. Okay, so adding structure is always good for these kids with just, again, generalized executive functioning difficulties. Telling them exactly what they need to do, give them detailed directions, having them work for a little bit and then reread the directions. Okay, then that's that engage, disengage, read the directions, and then re-engage. Okay, providing the set of rules. That can be important, especially when you're talking about higher order like math type of operations, where you have to memorize the orders of operation, or they have to memorize a formula, something like that, where they just get the information jumbled up, and then they make these careless mistakes, even though you know that they have the basic calculation skills intact, but it's because they just get overwhelmed. So providing a copy of the formula, or whatever they're doing, or the rules, those kinds of things really helps out. Allowing reworks. Okay, this is sometimes a hard point to sell, especially for our older kiddos in the junior high, high school ages. But if you know that the kid has the concept or has the idea, but they just made airhead mistakes, you're not really grading them then on their knowledge content. You're grading them on their executive functions. And of course, kids with poor executive functions are going to do poor on a test that tests executive functions. Mm-hmm. I mean, even at the college level, I allow some of my students to rework, stuff on there, and I don't call them tests. I call them assessments of knowledge, because tests are just too stressful. You don't want to stress them out. Mm-hmm. But I allow reworks on those kinds of things. So if they skipped a problem, or if they didn't answer it right, I'm not going to count it wrong, because you're not assessing them on what they know. You're assessing their executive functions. Providing the set of rules, those kinds of things. Preferential seating, of course, very basic. But preferential seating doesn't always necessarily mean up front. Sometimes kids do better in the back. Like if they're kids that need to stand up a lot or move around, having that kind of a kid in front may not be beneficial. The set of rules, of course, is important. Posted set of rules where you can refer to. In one of my clinical hours I had to do, there was a kid in the classroom. This is more of a severe classroom. This kid who has autism, he memorized the rules. He's very rigid with the rules. So each time a kid broke a rule, he would just be like, number seven, So it was real easy for me to know if a kid was breaking a rule, because the autistic kid was telling me. So get an autistic kid and put him or her in your classroom and have them memorize the rules, so then they can help out that way. Rewording directions also, make them more explicit, more direct, to the point. Take out some of the stuff that's not needed. You do those kinds of things at first, and then you have the child then start doing those kinds of things on their own. Because of course we want to teach them to function independently, but what we're trying to do just isn't working. And I think I probably hit on this idea last time I talked to you guys, but there's that misconception that just because it's more of a behavior characteristic that we can't teach it. I mean, we wouldn't think twice about a kid who has difficulty with word decoding. We wouldn't think twice about saying, okay, you can't decode at the 4th grade level, so let's go back to the 3rd grade or 2nd grade level or 1st grade level, wherever we need to go to, and let's hit on these skills and then work our way back up. And our goal is to get you caught back up to grade level. Where with these behaviors, the common thing that I get from a lot of people, the common response is, well, they're 13, they should know better, or they're 13, they should put their name on the paper, or those kinds of things. Yeah, you're right, they should, but they're not. And what we're doing right now is not helping them. So we need to take a step back and provide these behavioral interventions that we would, say, a 4th grader or 5th grader, and then we work on these skills, because these skills can be taught just like decoding can be taught.
Okay. So can I just jump in? I know you work in a school as well. How do you do that when a teacher is a little bit resistant to some of these interventions because she's got a classroom full of 30 kids, and she says, for example, you ask her to add some more structure and provide, detailed directions, and she says the directions are on the board. They're already there. So what do you then like create the structure for the student, or do you kind of model it for the teacher at first?
Yeah, well, and yeah, it kind of depends. What I try to do when I have time is to chat with the teachers before the conference, before actually I do my evaluation, and see with them what questions they want me to answer, and I try to shoot ideas back and forth and work with them where it's almost like bargaining, where I'll come up with one number or one idea, and then she'll come up with another, and hopefully we try to meet in the middle. And fortunately, it's taken me some time, but fortunately, I've gotten to the point where, at the very least, they consider some of my suggestions that I make in our conferences. I try to work with the teachers and let them know that the easiest way to provide these kinds of interventions is that you just do it classroom-wide. So you're not focusing on one student, you're doing it for everybody. So everybody's benefiting from these kinds of interventions. I try to work with them on how their classroom is set up and, those kinds of things. But there's a lot of times that when it comes down to it, we put these kinds of ideas or these kinds of interventions in the IEP, and then they really don't have a choice, after that. But of course, we want them to feel like we're forcing them to do these kinds of interventions. There's sometimes I'll talk about some of the research behind that and why we're doing that and those kinds of things. But really, the thing that changes people's mind the most is when they see results from that, and just continue to give the teachers and the school staff there as much support as possible, and modeling, just like what you guys said, modeling and showing them how to implement these kinds of things as quick and as easy as possible. But yeah, that's a very good question.
Very cool. Well, we paused for that question. I know that we had a question from the audience just about the PowerPoint. We have the PowerPoint from last time available up in the Google Drive. Have there been changes to the PowerPoint? Should we?
There has not.
Okay.
Nope.
So we'll just, everyone, the PowerPoint is located in the Google Drive. Let me know, you guys, if you want like a really quick 2-minute tutorial on how to access that again. But we did go through that kind of briefly, I think, in the last executive functioning episode. But I can show everyone again. So if you're in the audience and you're watching and you want to know how to access the Drive and access the PowerPoint, just let us know. Shoot us a tweet or something on Facebook, and we'll do that. Okay. Sorry.
Okay. No, very good. Okay, so like I said, rewording directions, making them more explicit. A real good strategy that I have the kids do is, like a story problem. There's a lot of information that's irrelevant. We don't care what the kid's name was. We don't care that the shoes or the kid's shoes were red when we're talking about how many marbles do they have. That kind of stuff. So you teach them, or you model for them, crossing information out that's not important. And then that leaves you with then the information that is important, and sometimes translating the story problem narrative into math terms. This is especially important for our kids that you see that they have good math calculation, but then their story problem, or math reasoning, is bottomed out, and then because they have the skills, they just don't know how to implement those skills with a lot of the distractors. So changing the directions there, and again, you model for them, and then you teach them to do it themselves. Changing open-ended questions to more like closed-ended type questions. Sometimes the kids have difficulty with like WH questions, and that can even be reflected with kids who do poor on like the vocabulary subtests. Again, from the Wechsler series, that you just know that this kid has a better vocabulary than what they're showing. I don't know if you guys have ever sat there during an evaluation and you're like, you come back with a scaled score of like 5 or 6, and you're like, you know what, this kid has a much better vocabulary. That they just have difficulty with open-ended questions. That has a lot to do with that organization. There's sometimes we see our kids that are very, very verbal, that they talk a lot because they kind of talk around the subject, and then they eventually get to the target. So sometimes those kinds of open-ended or WH questions even are kind of difficult for our kids with executive functioning difficulties. Okay. Providing word banks and adding writing cues can be very beneficial as well. Again, the word banks is when you find a difference between what they learn or what they know and being able to retrieve it. There's a number of different assessments that you can do to test this kind of hypothesis, but I've found that that's a very big factor when staff members kind of, I would say misdiagnose, but when they think a kid has a cognitive disability when they really don't, because they have difficulty getting the information out, that they have it in there, they can't retrieve it. And retrieving is an executive function, getting it out, because our encoding of information tends to be a little bit more of the posterior part of the brain, and retrieving or getting it out again is more anterior or frontal part of the brain. Okay, so those word banks or memory cues, memory strategies really help them out because it's in there. They just cannot find it. A lot of times I compare this to like my office, for example. If you give me a file, I'm going to just put it somewhere in my office. Okay, then you ask me to get that file. A day later, I can get it because I know it's in there, but it's going to take me a little bit longer to get it out. Okay, but it is in there. Now the other psych, she is very organized. So you give her a file, she's going to put that file under F, under the kid's last name. You ask her to get it, she's going to get it out right away. Okay, so the way that we organize the information when we're encoding it has a lot to do with how we retrieve the information later on. Okay, so those word banks, those multiple choice questions, there multiple choice possibilities, those kinds of things act as cues for these children. Okay, but now with that said, if this kid is inattentive or impulsive, then you're going to have to also focus on them checking their work and to look at all the choices before they choose an answer, because then you have to provide these kids cues, but then you also have to teach them not to be so impulsive and just choose the first thing that they see. Okay, minimize short answer and essay questions can help out. Sometimes having the kid talk through the answers that they want to do first can help. Teaching them the writing process, where the first draft, or when they're just first getting their ideas out, it doesn't have to be the finished product. Have the children make suggestions to change the task or task alterations, especially when they start getting older. That's going to give them also a sense of ownership of kind of what's going on. So you can ask them, yeah, you missed this question, Johnny, but I know that you know this and you do too. What could we do differently about the presentation of this? Those kinds of things. And even for our younger kids, we can do those kinds of things. And unfortunately, that's a and I forget it sometimes too, that's a very good idea, just to ask the kid, what could we do to make this easier? Of course they say, don't give me the spelling test or something. We can't do that, but getting an idea from them can also be beneficial. Let's see, provide scoring rubrics. So they know exactly what they're being scored on, so then they can work for a little bit, check the rubric, go back, because then that works on that self-monitoring as well. Provide verbal prompts or reminders, especially when we see them kind of getting off task. Visual cues can be very beneficial too. Like the math formula can be good. If we're talking about a kid with poor attention, a little blue dot on their desk. And of course, you have to tell this kid before you do this, but a little blue dot on the desk acts as the visual cue for them to get their attention back to what they're doing. Instead of the teacher always having to say, Johnny, are you paying attention? Johnny, are you paying attention? Johnny, why aren't you paying attention? Because then poor Johnny, even though he's not paying attention, he's going to feel like the teacher is picking on him. He could have a negative outlook on the school, on the teacher, those kinds of things, and they have that snowball effect. Schedules and lists can be very beneficial for our kids, especially our kids with poor cognitive flexibility. So if they know their schedule ahead of time, that's going to help them out, and especially if there's going to be a change in their schedule, that's going to help them out to give them a chance to kind of change that mindset. Okay. When checking work, start with the last completed problems. I found that this really works very well for our kids with some persistence difficulties or impersistence. The kids who start off really well, but then they fizzle at the end. So when, let's say it's some math problems, 10 math problems that they have to do. So, they finish the 10 math problems, you go off to something else, or you give them a little break, and when they come back, you have them check their work, but they start at number 10, because that works it's a kind of a twofold approach, because when they're checking their work, they're fresh again, they're cognitively fresh, so they're doing their best work while checking the work, but it just so happens that the work that they are checking is probably their poorest work, okay, or the work that they're more likely to commit the errors on, okay. Audio tapes and those kinds of things can help out with cues. Now there's it's a real neat little tool. It's called a Motivator, except it's not spelled like motivate. I forget how it's spelled. You can probably Google it, but it kind of looks like a pager. Right. For those people who are out there who know what a pager is. But you can set it to vibrate either like every minute, every 2 minutes, or intermittently. And when it vibrates, and the kid's supposed to, that's like their cue to pay attention. And you can even give them a little checklist of, was I paying attention, yes or no? And it really doesn't matter if they were paying attention or not, but if they check the box, then that just means that they're becoming more and more aware of it. I don't know if I have this on here, but another real good one that I like is that you have the kid rate their attention, or rate their motivation, or rate their behavior, or whatever throughout the day. And then you have the teacher or parent do the same thing. And then you compare little Johnny's ratings to the adults' ratings and see that they don't match up. And there's a lot of times that kids are misbehaving just because they don't understand that their behavior is inappropriate. Now, you can say, Johnny, you're not supposed to behave that way, but comparing those kinds of things, the ratings can be a little bit more beneficial. And of course, your goal is for the ratings to match, and of course, for the ratings to be good. He's aware of his bad behavior, but he's not doing anything to change it. Let's see, the alarms, that kind of goes along with the motivator. Work through the initial problems. Work through initial problems with the child and have them work independently. This also works for our kiddos with some anxiety difficulties, and even some initiation difficulties, where you give them that structure for the first 1 or 2 problems, and then you have them work independently. So if they have a question, that you tell them to reference the problems that they've already done first, because that's a good strategy. That's a good task, good strategy for them to do. And then if they still don't get it, then they can ask you for help, or the teacher, and then the teacher can go back through the problems instead of just giving them the answer. So sometimes that works as well. Okay, so.
Just if I could jump in for a second, you were talking about the motivator, the vibrator to kind of give reminders. We talked about that a little bit as an intervention I think we did an ADHD episode, and we talked about that having, and so I've done that before, and what I find really helpful, because you can buy those motivators specifically, to do that type of thing, and they're like $40 or something. You can download the app for, I think, $2 or something, and put it on an old cell phone, and have the kid wear the old cell phone, in their pocket, and that has worked really helpful. So I think that's a
very nice,
cool intervention.
It is. And sometimes I use that for me. When I'm working on my reports or something, my mind starts to drift off a little bit, so it helps me to stay on task too. Okay, so before I go on to interventions at the level of the person, does the group have any questions or anything like that at all, or should I just keep going?
I don't think anything's come in, right, Rebecca?
Right, no, we just got some positive feedback on Twitter from Tracy. She said she likes such practical tools and ideas to use with students, and she definitely wants to check out the Motivator also.
Oh, okay.
I remember seeing a really good YouTube video on the Motivator and how it works. I'm not sure who put it out there, but maybe if you Google it on YouTube, you might be able to find it. Go ahead, Matt. I don't want to interrupt you. You're on a good roll. We're like.
Oh no, you're good. You're good. Looks like we're doing good on time as well. Providing that structure for me. So yeah, and use that as an example too. There's some kids that they wander, they daydream, they get lost in the details, those kinds of things during work, where you tell them you have 10 minutes to get this done. For some kids, that can work. Now, a kid who's anxious, you don't want to do that because that's going to send their anxiety into hyper anxiety, anxiety overload. So, again, these interventions are very broad, very general ideas, but knowing your kid that you're working with is going to be very beneficial because these ideas will hopefully give you a starting point, or just maybe a new set of ideas or new way of looking at interventions, looking at these kinds of things. But the idea is that still each child is so unique and individual that you need to, your interventions, your suggestions should be tailored to the need of the child. And hopefully this will help out, with that. Okay, so intervening at the level of the person. So these interventions are a little bit more intense. And this may not be as applicable in the general education classroom setting. These might be more of at home or in a special education setting or in small group within the general education setting, those kinds of things, depending on how the classroom is structured. So teach this skill as you would an academic skill, kind of like what I talked about before when I was on my soapbox a little bit, which does take a lot of talent sitting down, being on your soapbox, but I was able to do it. Let's see, describe the problem behavior, okay? Set a goal, establish a procedure or set of steps to reach the goal, and supervise the child following the procedure, evaluate the process, and make changes if necessary, and then fade the supervision. Now, these interventions, and I think probably the other interventions as well, I got from, I can't recall the authors right now, but I think the book is called Interventions for Executive Functions. Or it's in the works cited, the references page. But that's where these came from. And the second edition book is out right now. It's a very good book. It's very short and to the point. So that's where I got a lot of these ideas from. Okay, so describe the problem behavior. So let's say that this kid has difficulty with self-monitoring. Okay, so you first describe the problem behavior that this kid is getting poor grades, not because they don't have the knowledge base, but because they cannot demonstrate the knowledge base. It's a lack of performance, not a lack of knowledge. Okay, so we set a goal. Let's say this kid rushes through their assignments too. So we set a goal that they have to work for 10 minutes. So putting that time restraint can work for our kids who daydream a little bit, that need that structure of saying you need to get done in 10 minutes, but it also helps out for our impulsive kids. So you set a time limit of 10 minutes, and the kid rushes through it and they get done in like 10 seconds. Well, they have to still sit there for 9 minutes and 50 seconds until the timer goes off. So then they have to go back and check their work. Okay, so you can set a goal of, a percentage correct on the worksheet, or you can set a goal of checking their work independently if you want. If you're not even worried about is it right or wrong, we just want the kid to get into the habit of doing the self-monitoring and self-corrections, then that would be a better goal. Also, if you're working with a kid with some self-esteem issues, self-concept issues, those kinds of things, especially maybe an older child who has experienced academic failures in the past, not because, again, they don't know the information, but just because they can't show it. And a lot of times our kiddos who get older, that's one of the most frustrating things for them. That's why they hate school, is because they are learning, but they can't show it, and they're still getting bad grades for it. So setting a goal like that would be very beneficial for these kids. Then establishing a procedure or a set of steps to reach the goal. So again, you say you've got 10 minutes to work on this. a procedure again. You could write or have a reminder on their desk to check your work, to check the formula on your little cheat sheet, or those kinds of things. So you establish that procedure, and you go through these kinds of things with the kid. Supervise the child following the procedure. So that's when you add that structure. Evaluate the process and make changes if necessary. And a real good thing too to do with this is that, and this works with planning as well, is that you have the child say, well, or you ask the child, how well do you think this worked? Okay. Oh, you didn't think this worked that well? What would you do to change that? Or why do you think this didn't work well? Or if you came up with an idea first and it didn't work well, then you try another thing, and you say, all right, Johnny, did this work better than the first thing that we tried? Okay, it did. Why did it work better? Those kinds of things. Poor Johnny, he's got a lot of stuff going on, doesn't he? But hopefully with these interventions we can help him out. And then eventually, of course, fade the supervision. And then have Johnny do those kinds of things on his own. Okay. Yeah. Incentive systems. Okay. I know there's mixed reviews about incentive systems. Sometimes they can be a little bit too complex. And then if they're too complex, then of course they don't work. But basic incentive systems seems to work pretty well. Again, for our younger kids, you're not gonna make a sticker chart for a 16-year-old. Again, it's kind of the same procedure. You describe the problem behavior, you set a goal, decide on possible rewards and contingencies, write a behavior contract, and evaluate the process and make changes. Okay, the behavior contract is a pretty good idea. It's not a new idea, but it's a pretty good idea for some of these kids. So that way they take more ownership of their behavior as well. Okay, so those are some general kind of interventions, and well, you know what? I probably should say I'm on slide 51 for other people who are following along with their own slides from the Dropbox. So sorry about that, people out there.
And Matt, I just wanted to jump in. We had another comment.
Jump right in.
Yeah, we had a comment from Tracy that she really liked the distinction between the lack of knowledge and the lack of performance, because they can look very similar but are so different. And I completely agree with that. I think sometimes our role is also to help the other adults involved, teachers and parents, understand that that distinction, because it can look like a lack of knowledge. It can also look like a lack of caring sometimes, like a child is doing difficult things on purpose in some way, and I think that's important too. So thanks,
absolutely.
Thanks, Tracy.
Yes, very good comment. Absolutely. And the more I learn and the more I study about these executive functions, and the more my evaluations are really focused on these executive functions, the more I find that there's that discrepancy between what they know and what they can show. And there's a lot of cases that I've had, even this year, that parents and teachers are concerned about a cognitive disability. And and we try to do an academic assessment first, because then that drives, that helps me decide which subtests, how does that going to make or shape my evaluation. But this kid who they're thinking might have a cognitive disability comes back with all average academics, solid average. We're not talking anything like even in the shady 80s, 90s, in the hundreds, even a little bit above, those kinds of things. So right there, I mean, that shows that when we're working with these kids, we are essentially not taking the whole place, but taking over the majority of their frontal lobe function, because we're adding the structure, we're giving them more one-on-one type attention, we're making sure that they're staying on task, those kinds of things. Because a child's ability to perform in the classroom is not just solely based on academics. There's all kinds of other factors, and such as, for example, the executive functioning systems that play a major role in these children's academic performance. And as they get older, there's more and more emphasis to those executive functions. Okay. Yes. All right. So inhibition interventions. Thinking the stop and think strategies, and actually there's this intervention book, which is really, really great, where I get a lot of the interventions from, I think it's called Teaching Children to Learn, and it's in its second edition. And Jack Naglieri, and there's another author who authored it, and it's about $30. You can get it on Amazon, and if you got really good negotiating skills, you can get your school to buy it for you, like I did. But it comes with a CD, and they allow you to print off these worksheets and print off these interventions that I attach to the end of my report as kind of like another appendix. And there's some really, really good stop and think strategies, some really good like planning strategies that steps these things out for these kids and for the parents too. So I would definitely check that out as well, if you're able. But anyway, so the stop and think strategies really help out with these kids with disinhibition. Cue the child prior to starting or engaging in the situation. Add a cue to sight words typically missed. So I see this a lot with the kids who, this part of that, like kind of a cognitive flexibility, inhibition, because you have to inhibit a response to be able to be flexible in your thought process. Okay, so all these executive functions are related to each other too. I mean, you can't think of these functions in isolation. You can't think of here's inhibition over here, here's cognitive flexibility over there, here's planning over here, those kinds of things, because they're all related. So you look at how does a kid function with doing these assessments together. Okay, so the sight words. So there's a lot of times that we have these kids with some inhibition difficulties or cognitive flexibility difficulties that they're reading sight words, right? Sight word reading, that's our really quick, really rapid reading. That's what we need for a good fluency. And then they come to a word that they don't know, or that's a new word, and then they cannot inhibit that response to respond in their sight word reading cognitive mode. So then they see that first letter and they just read that word that comes to their mind. Instead of shifting their cognitive set to sight word reading, or I'm shifting from sight word reading to word decoding and then shifting back to sight word reading. So a lot of times if you bring attention to that sight word that they're missing, making a little dot or underlining it, that's their cue. And then you can, again, talk to the child about this before you get started. That's their cue to shift their mindset or inhibit that tendency to read it as a sight word and sound it out. That tends to work really well. And then, of course, then we look at providing it with structure at first. So we're doing it for the child, but with the child, and explaining them why we're doing this. Excuse me. And then once they get the hang of it, then you have the child go through it and say, all right, now what I want you to do, Johnny, is underline all the new words, or all the words that you've had some difficulty with. That way, when you come to it, you need to sound it out and not read it as a sight word. And that helps Johnny then become more aware of, you know what, there's some words I have some difficulties with that I'm going to need to do these strategies with. Teaching coping skills, those kinds of things can really help out. How you react when you reach your frustration tolerance. There's some people that can, they have to keep working, and then they solve the problem. There's some people who just need to take a step away, take a breath, do something else, come back to it. And that's all about that self-awareness. So you need to work with the kid on understanding how do they solve problems. Are they the type that they have to take a break and come back to it? Or are they the type that they can kind of work through it on their own? And getting them to recognize those kinds of things and recognize when they've reached that frustration tolerance really helps out with that behavior, academically and behaviorally. Increased supervision, and just teaching the importance of inhibition. Just teaching why is this important? Why do we need to do this? There's a lot of kids, especially more of our intelligent kids, that they can be kind of challenging to teach sometimes because they want to know why. What's the purpose of this? Because they're thinking not so much, small picture of what's going on at this second in Mrs. Smith's classroom in, USA town, USA, that kind of thing. That they're thinking, how am I going to use this in real life? What's the purpose of this? And when when you approach it from that perspective, you're increasing their motivation. There's sometimes kids, I think this was talked about too, just a little bit ago, that they might seem lazy, unmotivated, those kinds of things, where they just have some of these, executive functioning difficulties, where, there's no kid who wakes up and says, you know what, I'm going to be lazy today, or I'm going to be totally unmotivated today. There's always a reason behind it. There's a lot of times that I've found that kids who have poor motivation, that they have some difficult. Oh, was there a beep?
That was my beep, but I don't think it's anything. Sorry.
Is that my beep? I need to finish up, or I need to move on. Was that my motivator going off?
Motivator.
I was paying attention. With the planning, these kids come up with a poor plan to how to solve the problem, and then they lack that flexibility to be able to say, how well is this plan working? Do I need to change my plan? And then lack that ability then to decide on a new plan of action and then try that. So there's a lot of times these kids with poor motivation, that they have poor planning, so their plan is inefficient or ineffective, and then they go to solve the problem, they don't get it right away, and then they give up. Okay, and that's motivation, or that's perceived as poor motivation, when in actuality it's poor executive functions that has caused the poor motivation, or motivation is the secondary characteristic. I know I haven't talked about it yet, but the tower test on the DCAFs, which is similar to like the Tower of Hanoi or Tower of London test, is a really, really good test at looking at the efficiency of problem-solving behavior, or how efficient is the child. Because the less efficient the child is, the more motivation they will need to solve the task. The way it's done in the tower test is that you're given these discs, and you have to follow these rules, and you have to make the discs match the picture. You have to move them around. So you look at, when the kid is all the way done with the whole subtest, you look at how many moves they made, and then you compare that to the minimum amount of moves that they could have made. If there's a tower that takes 5 moves to make, but they took 20 moves to get there, yeah, they still got it. So their overall achievement score is going to be good, but their efficiency is not so good. So they have the ability, they're just not efficient about it. And usually that's related to the planning. Okay, so anyway, all right, so selective focus and sustained attention ideas, even though, attention does fall under that executive functioning umbrella, even though there's a lot of, the way the reports are organized, attention is kind of on its own. But anyway, provide a cue to get the attention back to the task at hand. And that's like that dot on the desk, or whatever. There's sometimes, let's say the teacher's like, well, I don't have time for that. Okay. You say, okay, I understand. You have a large class, you're busy, but you could put a dot on the front of the room, and that could be the cue, not only for that child, but the whole class to pay attention. Or you could set something else up, or you could set up a little timer that goes off, for the whole class to do. So that could be the cue for the whole class to pay attention, not just poor Johnny. Okay. Yeah. Provide a task schedule with breaks provided in there. A lot of times ADHD kids have difficulty with motivation, not again because they don't want to finish the work, but because they have difficulty understanding, when am I going to get a break. I found in my just doing evaluations that if I just have a blank sheet of paper and I write 1 to 5, and each time we get something done I cross a number off, and then we get to take a break, I mean, that helps them out a lot. And of course, if I'm kind of strapped for time, I may not remind Johnny that we just finished the task and move on and see if he notices. Sometimes they do, and then be like, Dr. Matt, we got 2 tasks done, and I don't see anything crossed off. Oh yeah, sorry about that, Johnny. Sorry. Okay, so again, just teaching the importance of education. Yep, that's important too. But teaching the importance of attention can just be important as well, and can get the kid to understand, my teachers tell me to pay attention all the time, but now I understand why I should pay attention. Now it makes sense. Have the student repeat back what was said. That's a real easy way to check for understanding. And sometimes it helps them to practice how to summarize and how to just get the important bits of information out.
Too, that you were talking about just the importance of them understanding, why you should pay attention and how, how that's important. Also would be like what being attentive looks like. Like some kids may not realize that, when they're playing with something, their phone or doing this or, multitasking, that's not being attentive to maybe a speaker or something like that. So sometimes teaching them that, what you're doing right now, that doesn't really look like when you're attending. That's not good attention. You should be looking at the speaker, or you should be looking at your worksheet, or you should be focused, that type of thing. So some kids kind of, I found, need to be taught what that looks like and what that is.
And
absolutely.
It's 8:50, and I know we want to get out of here by 9 for Walking Dead, or at least I do. So you have so much great information, Matt, and we wanted to get to maybe case studies or discussion. So would you be able to kind of breeze through your next few slides so we can?
Sure, absolutely.
Thank you.
And, if you guys need me to come back for part 3, too, that's fine too with me. I don't care. I could talk about this kind of stuff all day. So, okay. Let's see. Intermittently reinforcing behavior is good, so they don't know when they're going to be reinforced. Okay, so task initiation. So this can be a little bit difficult, a little bit more challenging to even assess, and let alone to intervene for. Focus on motivation can help out with that, providing incentives. Working on planning and organization. There's a lot of times that kids are just overwhelmed. They have that difficulty with organizing information, visual information, so they just get overwhelmed, so then they shut down, so they stop, or they have difficulty starting the task. Make sure one task is completed prior to starting another. Sometimes the kid is afraid of, or the kid doesn't like to do the math worksheet because it's hard, so face the fears. We'll work on self-concept issues if that's the case, those kinds of things. A verbal visual cue, you do something like, I want you to start on 3, 1, 2, 3, or something like that, or red light, yellow light, green light, or whatever. And again, that's a very easy intervention that you can provide for the whole class. Yeah. Structured help for the first problem, and if still having issues, refer back to the first problem. Those kinds of things we've kind of talked about before. Also, a real kind of when you're working with younger kids, you have to be silly anyway. I think that's the reason why I get along so well with some of these younger kids, because we're both at the same maturity level. So they relate well to me. I relate well to them. But I've seen a teacher that did this intervention. I really liked it for the shifting. Cognitive set. When it was time to put your math book away, they actually acted like they're in a car and they were shifting gears, and that was their sign for, okay, math is done, now we need to start shifting into reading or whatever. So they were doing the car sound, the that kind of stuff, and they were shifting, and the kids loved it, and it seemed to work pretty well. So I forgot to put that in here as well. Okay, planning. Again, just bringing the importance of planning itself, and I got a lot of these again from the Naglieri Helping Children Learn book. That is definitely a must for you guys. When reading or watching TV, stop and ask the child what to think is going to happen and why, and what's going to come next. Those kinds of things. That's easy for parents to do. I guess I kind of skipped this one. Allowing the child a different choice of studying, like for spelling words. They can either, write the word 20 times each. They can look up some definitions. They can find pictures of it and write down the word behind or under the picture. Those kinds of things. And then you have the child talk about why did they choose this particular strategy and not this one, and did this work? Not, that kind of thing. Help with short and long-term goals with visuals. Break larger assignments into smaller sections with due dates. So, if they have a big paper that's due in 2 weeks, that's, let's say, 5 pages, then you set a due date for the first 2 pages. Or you set a due date for the rough draft, or those kinds of things where you add smaller due dates before the larger ones. That adds that structure. Associate similar successfully completed tasks to novel ones. And that's the sometimes the difficulty with planning is that you can teach them how to plan for this particular task when you're sitting with them, but teaching them to use that skill in everyday life or in everyday functioning areas can be a little bit more challenging. So really focusing on that can be helpful. Some cognitive flexibility ideas. Reducing the novelty or the newness of the task. So you want the child to be as familiar with the tasks. A lot of times allowing them some practice items that are very similar to what they have to do can really help out. Other times having them warm up with activities that they did the day before that that they're really good at, that can help them kind of get that cognitive flexibility, get their mind going a little bit. Sometimes kids with cognitive flexibility issues, I kind of compare them to, like Wile E. Coyote. Poor guy, he's always chasing after the bird, right? And when he runs, he's like running in place. He's not going anywhere. The wheels are turning, but then he eventually goes. But usually he falls off a cliff or, that kind of thing. Sometimes these kids with those cognitive flexibility issues are very similar to that their mind is going and they're in place. They're not doing anything yet, but they're still in that transitioning phase. It just takes them longer. Decrease the speed of presentation and complexity. Sorry. So slowing down the presentation, smaller chunks, those kinds of things, because again, these kids have difficulty shifting to what you're doing right now. Changing the open-ended questions to more closed-ended questions. Encourage self-monitoring. Again, if you're looking at a kid with flexibility issues, a lot of times they're going to have difficulties with the first couple problems that they do. Remember, we talked about kids who have some persistence difficulties or impersistence, that they're more likely to commit errors on the final parts of the assignment. These kids with more of a flexibility issue can have a greater tendency to commit errors on the first parts of the assignment. So getting them to recheck those problems that they did initially, those kinds of things can really help out. Providing a little bit more structure initially, those kinds of things. Teach multiple ways of solving a task. That can help, or that can be even worse for the poor kid with flexibility issues. Again, knowing the kid is beneficial here. Teach awareness of internal states. So the child becomes more aware when he or she is stressed, because as we become stressed, then our problem-solving ability, our planning, those kinds of important things are less effective. Increasing reinforcement and segmenting tasks into a step-by-step process. Okay. Any questions?
We got one awesome comment from our friend Tracy. She said, awesome tools and ideas, excited to implement with students tomorrow. And speaking of implementing tomorrow, I posted a link to the Nagliari book, Helping Kids Learn, on both Facebook pages, and I discovered that you can buy it used for really inexpensive, and there's lots of booksellers that sell it used. I'm hoping the CD will still be in there and in good condition. But
Oh yeah, that's a great book. I have those suggestions in my report almost every time.
I love that too, just putting the intervention right at the end of this report. I like that recommendation also. That's really great.
Oh, thanks. I would like to say that was my idea, but it was not. So
we're out of time, guys. We have to wrap it up. Thank you so much, Dr. Matt, for all your information. And we'd like to encourage our viewers out there to read through these case studies, and the PowerPoint presentations are on our website. And Matt, are you okay with us giving out your email address if people want to email you or ask questions or anything?
Yep. I've got my contact information here. I've got my email.
Okay, perfect.
And also, for further research, there's the school neuropsych website actually, and they have you can of course go through the full school neuropsych training. Or you can go to the individual webinars that they have on the DCAFs, So you have the professionals. Sometimes you even have some of the authors talking to you about the tests that they help author, which is really neat. About how to implement and interpret the DCAFs, the NEPSI, Introduction to School Neuropsychology in general. Dr. McCloskey, who I reference very often, he does the executive functioning presentation there, and I was lucky enough in my training to hear Dr. McCloskey talk. And I mean, if you think I can talk about executive functions, I don't even compare to him. Also, I talked a little bit about cognitive processing, Dr. DeHane. And there's the CHC cross-battery assessment with Dr. Flanagan, Alfonso, and Dr. Ortiz as well.
Thank you very much. Awesome resources.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Check them out.
Okay. So we're going to close out. We're back November 15th. We're going to be talking about working with English language learners, ELL students. So join us again for that. And thanks again, Dr. Rebeck. This was awesome. You rock.
Great. Good deal. Good to hear. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone.